The first time Jonah Bennett saw the woman who would change his house, she was standing beneath his windmill with one hand pressed to her hat, a single carpetbag at her feet, and his 8-year-old son 30 feet above her on the slick iron frame with a strip of blue ribbon wound around his fist. The September wind kept nudging the blades with a dry, complaining click. Noah's bare toes were white against the crossbeam. Jonah had seen calves born wrong, rivers come up overnight, and hail strip a field to bone in 20 minutes flat. But there was a special kind of fear that came only when the thing you loved most had climbed too high and grief had made him brave in all the wrong ways. "Don't move," Jonah called, already dropping the sack of oats from his shoulder. The boy didn't look down. The woman did. She had a plain brown coat, travel dust up to her hems, and the steady face of somebody who had learned long ago that panic never helped a soul. "I haven't moved yet," she said. "Thought I'd wait for his father before I made things worse." Jonah was at the base of the windmill in 3 strides. He set one boot on the lower rung and looked up. "Noah, hand me the ribbon and come down." Noah wrapped the blue strip tighter around his fist. That ribbon had belonged to Ruth. It used to live on the Sunday hat she wore to church in Hamilton until the day the fever took her and left the whole house sounding wrong. Jonah had burned shirts, blankets, even the rocking chair where she'd sat through those last cold nights, because he could not bear a single thing that still seemed to hold the shape of her. But the ribbon kept turning up. In a Bible, in the bread drawer, under Noah's pillow. Grief in a small house was like wind through chinks. You sealed one place, and it found another. "Buddy," Jonah said, softer now, the iron's damp. Noah finally looked at him. His face was too old for 8. Then he glanced at the stranger woman below, and shame crossed him so quickly Jonah almost missed it. The boy had scared another one off before she'd even reached the porch. "Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight, and if you feel like it, leave a word in the comments about where you're listening from." There is something comforting about knowing how far a lonely house can reach when a story is being told. Jonah climbed. He did not rush. Noah was most dangerous when cornered. Jonah kept one eye on the boy, one hand firm on the cold iron, and felt the old rope burn across his palm pull tight as he rose. Above him the blue ribbon fluttered like a trapped bird. "She here for the job?" Noah asked. It was the first full sentence the boy had spoken in 6 days. Jonah swallowed. "Looks that way. I don't want one." "I know." Noah's chin started trembling, though he held it hard. "They always leave." The words hit lower than any fist ever had. Jonah climbed the last few feet, eased himself onto the crossbeam, and sat there beside his son with the valley spread out below them, gold stubble fields, the dark line of cottonwoods at the creek, and beyond that the blue shoulders of the Bitterroot Mountains standing off and uninterested, the way mountains do when a man's life is coming apart. "They leave," Noah said again, quieter. Jonah looked at the ribbon wound round the boy's knuckles. "Sometimes they do." That was all the truth he had in him. He slipped 2 fingers under the ribbon and loosened it. Noah let him. A moment later Jonah drew the boy against his chest and climbed down with Noah clinging to him like he had when he was half this age, and lightning shook the walls. When Jonah's boots finally hit dirt, the woman bent, picked up the carpetbag, and said, "Mara Ellis, I answered your advertisement." Jonah set Noah on the ground behind him. "You picked a poor time. I gathered that." Noah ducked around the corner of the water trough and vanished toward the barn. Jonah pulled the folded ad from his vest pocket as if he could blame the paper for what had brought her. Wanted, respectable woman to mind house and child through harvest. Room, board, wages fair. He had written it because the pastor's wife said a widowed man raising a grieving boy alone looked too much like neglect to people eager to judge. He had written it because his kitchen smelled of sour milk and cold ash. He had written it because there were mornings Noah would not eat unless Jonah lied and said the dead could smell breakfast. He had not written it because he wanted anyone inside the wreckage. "You've come a long road for fair wages," he said. "From Missoula." She lifted one shoulder. "I've come farther for less." Up close, Jonah saw she was not young, not in the way hired girls usually were. Mid-30s, maybe a little more. Her face would not have turned heads in town, except there was a quiet steadiness in it that made you look twice. Her hands were reddened from work, and there was a faint white scar along the side of her jaw that disappeared into her hairline. She looked like a woman life had used hard without managing to bend crooked. "I can pay through the month," Jonah said, already half meaning to send her back on the morning stage. Mara looked toward the barn where Noah had vanished. The boy lost his mother. Jonah's jaw tightened. That plain? No, her voice stayed gentle. Only to somebody who's met grief before. He should have thanked her for the courtesy of not saying more. Instead, he said, Mrs. Cafferty in town didn't mention the child climbs iron before strangers arrive. Perhaps she thought you'd list that in the next advertisement. It caught Jonah off guard enough that he almost smiled. Almost. Then wheels sounded on the road. Jonah turned and saw the black carriage before he saw the man inside it. Vernon Blackwell never came to the farm except to collect, threaten, or measure what he meant to take later. He stepped down with the same polished boots and silver-headed cane he wore in town, though there wasn't a patch of dirt on the place that deserved leather that fine. Ruth had once said her father dressed as if the whole world owed him a clean floor. Blackwell's gaze moved from Jonah to Mara to the empty windmill and came to rest on the ribbon in Jonah's fist. So, he said, you finally admitted the boy needs supervision. Jonah's back went rigid. State your business and be done with it. My business, Blackwell said, is my grandson. The county clerk has prepared the petition. You've had nearly a year to make this home suitable. One housekeeper gone, another drunk by all reports, the child half wild, lessons neglected, and now word reaches town that he climbs machinery while you work the far field. Mara said nothing, but Jonah could feel her listening. Blackwell took a folded packet from inside his coat and tapped it against his glove. I was prepared to give you 30 days, out of respect for Ruth. But respect is a wasting asset where you're concerned. So hear me plainly. Keep a decent woman under this roof, get the boy into proper instruction, and convince the court this place is fit. Fail, and I petition for guardianship of Noah Bennett and immediate review of your note. The air went thin. That note was the mortgage on the North Field and half the creek water. Jonah had been paying on it since before Ruth died. Blackwell held it through his bank, and a man who owned the paper owned the sleep of the man who signed it. You don't care about the boy, Jonah said. Blackwell's mouth barely moved. I care that my daughter's son should not grow up illiterate in a drafty graveyard of a house. Mara set down her bag. Sir. Blackwell looked at her as if furniture had spoken. I'm only the woman who answered an advertisement, she said. But if you mean to discuss taking a child from his father, perhaps you might lower your voice enough that the child doesn't hear it from the yard. For the first time, Blackwell actually saw her. Jonah saw it too. The quick, cold assessment. Her clothes too plain for refinement. Her age too settled for innocence. Her manner too steady to frighten easy. And who are you to advise me? Blackwell asked. No one powerful, Mara said, which is often the same thing as being honest. Blackwell's eyes sharpened. Then he smiled, and that was worse. If you are indeed the new nurse, madam, I suggest you learn quickly. The Bennett household has a habit of disappointing women. He handed Jonah the packet and climbed back into the carriage. The wheels had barely turned before Noah appeared from behind the barn, white-faced and shaking. He had heard enough. I ain't going with him, he said. Jonah crossed the yard in 2 strides and crouched before him. You hear me now. Nobody is taking you today. Today, Noah whispered, catching the word Jonah had not meant to choose. That was the point of no return, though Jonah did not know it yet. Not the arrival. Not the ribbon on the windmill. Not even Vernon Blackwell with papers in his hand. It was the look in his son's face when he understood his home had become a thing other men could speak of owning. Jonah rose slowly and turned to Mara Ellis, the stranger with the carpet bag and the scar and the calm eyes. If you still want the job, he said, the words feeling strange in his own mouth. There's coffee gone bitter on the stove and a room that ain't fit for company. But it's what I've got. Mara looked at Noah, then at the black carriage shrinking down the road, then back at Jonah. I don't need fit for company, she said. I need honest wages and no lies. Jonah nodded once. Then you'd best come inside. The Bennett house had not smelled like bread in 11 months. It smelled like that by the second evening Mara Ellis was under its roof. She moved through the place without fuss, not trying to erase Ruth, not trying to place herself where another woman had stood, only making order where grief had soured into neglect. She beat rugs on the line until the dust rose in hard golden clouds. She opened windows Jonah had kept shut through summer. She scrubbed Noah's ink-stained hands before supper and set a basin by the back door so he could wash without being told twice. She mended the blue shirt Ruth had never quite finished patching. She found the cracked jar of cinnamon at the back of the pantry and put enough of it in the oatmeal the next morning that even Jonah tasted childhood for a second and had to look away from the table. Noah watched her like a feral colt watches an outstretched hand. He did not help. He did not speak more than necessary. But on the third day, Jonah came in from repairing fence and found the two of them on the porch step, Noah whittling at a stick with careful little cuts, while Mara read aloud from a tattered McGuffey reader she had pulled from her bag. The boy was listening. Jonah stopped in the doorway with the dust at the back of his throat and a weight in his chest he had not felt in so long it frightened him. Mara glanced up. "Your son knows more letters than he pretends." Noah scowled. "I know all of them. Then tomorrow we'll tackle words too stubborn to behave." Jonah hung his hat on the peg. "He'll fight you on sums." Mara turned a page. "So will I. That's why I prefer to win early." That night, after Noah had finally gone to bed and the lamps were turned low, Jonah found her at the kitchen table, studying his account book. He stiffened. Something wrong. Maybe. She tapped the page. "These payments to Blackwell Bank. You keep your receipts. In a tobacco tin above the stove. Fetch them." There was no reason he should have obeyed so quickly, except Mara asked questions like a person expecting answers instead of excuses. Jonah brought the tin down. She spread the receipts in neat rows and compared them to the ledger, her brow drawing tight. "Your principal barely moved," she said. "It wasn't a good spring. It wasn't a good anything from what I can see. But that isn't what this says. Mr. Bennett, these figures don't walk straight." Jonah pulled up a chair. The lamp flame hissed soft in the chimney. "You know books. My father kept records for the county in Idaho before his lungs gave out. I copied ledgers half my girlhood." Her finger moved over the page. "This 7 was changed from a 1. Here too. And this payment posted in May is marked to interest, though the note you signed says excess goes to principal after taxes." A slow cold worked through him. "You certain?" She met his eyes. "Certain enough that I wouldn't sleep while leaving it unsaid." The easy path presented itself the next morning in a brown envelope. Blackwell sent it by the sheriff's deputy, together with a note written in a hand so careful it looked bloodless. "Withdraw the court matter, surrender the North Field and Noah's schooling to my care, and the remainder of your debt may be restructured favorably. Dismiss the hired woman and avoid further embarrassment." Jonah read it standing by the porch rail while the sun climbed over the far pasture. Noah was in the yard trying to fix a broken wheel on the little wagon Ruth's brother had carved him. Mara came out with a pail of wash water and watched Jonah's face change. "What is it?" He handed her the note. She read it once and looked out at Noah. "He wants the boy and the water. He wants what my wife chose when she married me." Jonah folded the paper until the edges bit his fingers. "Could sign. Let him have the field. Send Noah to school in town where he's warm and fed and dressed proper. Might even keep the house." Mara did not speak. Jonah laughed once, without humor. "Hear that? That is a man trying to sound noble while he considers selling his own blood. You are considering survival. Same thing some days." Mara set the pail down. "Would the boy forgive you?" Jonah looked at Noah. The child had his mother's bent head when he worked, the same stubborn line to his mouth, the same refusal to ask for help even when the wheel axle would not seat right and his small hands were reddening with effort. "No," Jonah said. "Then there is your answer." He looked at her then, really looked. She was not young, not pretty in the effortless way town men noticed. But there was truth in her face, and rest in it too, as if she had stopped wasting strength pretending life had given her gentler roads than it had. "Why stay?" he asked. "You could take the stage tomorrow, find a house with easier people in it." Something flickered in her expression, there and gone. Folks who've been left behind learn the weight of a door closing. That's why we notice when one stays open. It was a small line, nearly lost under the scrape of Noah's wagon wheel on the dirt, but Jonah felt it settle somewhere deep. The town noticed Mara by the first Sunday. No place in a valley carries news faster than a churchyard after service. Women who had not offered Jonah so much as a pie after Ruth died found time to inspect the stranger under his roof. Men who borrowed his tools without returning them studied him like he had become an indecent story told in daylight. Mara bore it with such calm that Jonah became angry on her behalf before she did. At Hatcher's Mercantile, Amos Hatcher polished the same scarred patch of counter 3 times while Jonah bought flour. Heard Blackwell's moving on the Bennett boy. he muttered without meeting Jonah's eyes. Hurt or hope? Jonah asked. Amos flinched. I mind my own shelf space. That a man can say a thing like it's virtue. On the way out, two women stood near the bolt cloth whispering just softly enough to be heard. Too old for a governess. No references local. Odd that a decent widow would hire on out there alone. Mara paused by the door, turned, and said with perfect civility, You ladies needn't worry. If I had designs on your husbands, I'd be aiming much higher. Jonah heard Amos choke on a laugh. He tried to turn into a cough. By the time they reached the wagon, Noah was grinning for the first time in weeks. That afternoon, the boy brought Mara a broken foal halter to mend. The next day, he let her cut his hair. On the day after that, he followed her to the garden patch and asked, very low, if she knew how to keep frost from tomatoes. She answered him as if boys who had half forgotten speaking were the most ordinary thing in the world. At night, Jonah heard them through the thin hall wall, reading. Noah stumbling over words. Mara never rushing him. The small click of fear inside Jonah began to ease against his will, which made what came next hurt sharper. On the 12th day, Blackwell himself rode out with Sheriff Bell. Bell was a broad, weary man with tobacco permanently staining one side of his mustache. He kept licking a bad tooth when he was nervous, and he licked it now as Jonah came to the porch. Sorry for the intrusion, Bell said. Then try it from the road next time. Blackwell dismounted slowly. A hearing has been set for Thursday. Guardianship and review of the note. Mara came to stand just behind Jonah. Noah was in the kitchen doorway, one hand wrapped around the frame. Sheriff Bell cleared his throat. There was also a report your smokehouse lock was found broken and the child wandering near the creek at dusk last evening. My smokehouse lock was broken because somebody pried it, and my son was at the creek because he chased our dog. Blackwell's voice stayed smooth. A household in disorder creates opportunities for tragedy. Jonah took one step down off the porch. You calling my son's grief disorder? I'm calling your pride expensive. Noah made a small sound behind them. Mara turned, went to him, and set a hand on his shoulder. Then she lifted her head and asked Bell, Sheriff, when a man files a complaint against himself by cutting his own smokehouse and then reporting it, what sort of fool does the law assume him to be? Bell blinked. Ma'am, because either Mr. Bennett endangered his own case for the pleasure of an evening chore, or someone means to build a picture that does not match the truth. Bell's bad tooth worried under his lip. Blackwell smiled thinly. Careful, madam. Involvement can stain a reputation. Mara's voice did not waver. Then your reputation must be laundered daily. After they left, Jonah found his hands shaking. He walked to the far fence line at dusk, needing distance before anger made him stupid. The cut wire lay where he found it, fresh and mean. Hoofprints crossed the north field. Someone had been testing boundaries. Mara came up behind him, carrying his work gloves. The storm's not waiting for Thursday, she said. Jonah stared at the western sky. A hard bank of cloud was gathering over the mountains, blue-black and low. No. She was quiet a moment. Then, in a tone as careful as a hand easing a splinter free, she said, If you were alone in this, what would you do? Take Noah and run till Blackwell's horse dropped under him. And if you do that, he wins anyway. The story becomes what he said it was. A careless father fleeing the law. Jonah rubbed a hand over his face. The stubble scratched loud in the silence. What would you have me do? Stand. She glanced toward the house where lamplight had just turned gold in the window. And let the people who care about the truth stand with you. If you had been Mara then, standing at the edge of a field that was not yours, with a frightened boy beginning to trust you and a wounded man forgetting how not to, would you have stayed and fought another person's war, or would you have taken the first stage west before loving them could cost you everything? That is the kind of question a life slips into without warning. Jonah let out a breath that felt older than he was. There aren't many people left. Then we'll begin with the few. The storm came after midnight, but not from the sky. Jonah woke to the smell of smoke and the dog hurling itself against the back door. He was out of bed before his mind caught up. The barn was lit inside like a furnace, orange light punching through cracks in the boards. Horses screamed. The night air bit cold against his bare throat, but the heat from the fire hit his face like an open oven the moment he reached the yard. No answer. Mara burst onto the porch in her shawl, hair loose, eyes wide but clear. His bed's empty. Everything inside Jonah went still. Get the chest from under my bed, he said. And the receipt tin. She didn't ask why. He was already running for the barn. He got the mare out first, then the gray gelding. One of the stall doors had been latched from outside. Coal oil. He could smell it now, sharp and greasy under the cedar smoke. Not accident. Not weather. Deliberate. From beyond the barn came the beat of hooves. Jonah spun. At the far edge of the yard, half hidden in dark, a rider was moving fast toward the north road with a small body thrown across the saddle before him. Noah. Jonah snatched Ruth's old Winchester from the wall pegs just inside the tack room and ran for his horse. Mara was already there with the chest and the receipt tin wrapped in a blanket. They took him, she said, though she needn't have. I know. She thrust the bundle into the saddlebag. Then I'm riding too. No. Her eyes flashed. I can track numbers, men, and lies. Tonight you need all three. There was no time to argue. Jonah hauled her up behind him and kicked the horse hard. They followed by sound first, then by sign. Jonah's skill with land had always been the one thing nobody argued with. He could read broken sage, disturbed gravel, the shape of water in the dark. He saw where the kidnapper cut through the dry wash instead of staying road. He saw where the horse stumbled under extra weight. He saw the fresh scrape of a child's boot against limestone at the creek crossing and felt a savage surge of hope. Noah was fighting. They rode by moonlight and burning lungs until the line shack near Miller's Cut rose black against the slope. A second horse was tied outside. Jonah slid down soundless and helped Mara from the saddle. Stay behind me. She opened the blanket bundle. Inside were the receipts, the mortgage note, and the small iron deed box Ruth had insisted on keeping. He came for this too, didn't he? Jonah stared. The lock on the box was broken. Mara's breath caught. He knew what he wanted. From inside the shack came Noah's muffled cry. Then Vernon Blackwell's voice, unhurried as grace before supper. You took your time. Jonah shouldered the door open. Noah was tied to a chair near the stove, face streaked with soot and tears, jaw set hard in a way that made him look painfully like Ruth. Blackwell stood beside the table with a revolver. Reese Doolin, Blackwell's foreman, leaned against the wall nursing a split lip, likely earned from Noah's boots. I might have known, Jonah said, raising the Winchester. Blackwell shook his head. If you fire, my hand closes before your bullet lands. Mara moved just inside the doorway. Jonah felt rather than saw her study the room. What do you want? He asked. Blackwell looked genuinely bored by the question. Efficiency. Your son signs a transfer at majority to my management. Until then, he resides where his inheritance is protected. You surrender the North Field tonight. The bank forgoes public unpleasantness, and everyone is spared the vulgarity of Thursday. Jonah's hands were steady. Inside, he was burning clean through. You set my barn on fire. A barn can be rebuilt. You took a child. A child can be properly raised. Noah jerked against the chair. I ain't yours. Blackwell's face changed then, the polished mask slipping just enough to show the iron underneath. You are your mother's blood, boy. That is the only part of you worth preserving. Mara stepped forward. Jonah almost barked for her to stop, but something in her expression held him. She had seen something. Not in the room. In the papers. Mr. Blackwell, she said, voice calm as still water. You altered the note. His eyes cut to her. The principal should have dropped below 800 by spring, she went on. You rewrote postings and shifted payments. And you came tonight because you were afraid of what might be in that box. For the first time, a flicker. Tiny, but there. Blackwell smiled without warmth. A hired woman with opinions on finance. Rural life does produce novelty. Mara set the papers on the table and laid one receipt open. This is Ruth Bennett's trust disbursement. Sealed and witnessed. It was applied nowhere. Jonah stared. He had never seen that receipt. Mara must have pulled it from the deed box on the ride. Blackwell's mouth flattened. Give me that. No, she said. Reese shoved off the wall. Jonah moved the rifle. Sit back. Everything tightened at once. The stove ticked hot. Noah's chair scraped. Wind pressed at the shack walls. Blackwell lifted the revolver toward Mara. Jonah fired first, not at Blackwell, but at the lamp on the shelf behind him. Glass burst. Oil flared across the wall. In the half-second of confusion that followed, Mara lunged for Noah. Jonah crossed the room, and Reese slammed into him shoulder first. They hit the table hard. The papers scattered. The revolver cracked. Pain tore along Jonah's upper arm. Hot, and wet. Noah shouted. Mara cut at the rope with Jonah's pocket knife. Blackwell came through the smoke like a dark shape from a bad dream. Came discarded, hand clawing for the receipt. Jonah caught him by the coat and drove him into the stove. The old man gasped, more rage than hurt. Sign him over, Blackwell shouted, or watch the place burn with him in it. There it was. The whole naked thing. Not law. Not blood. Possession. Jonah could have killed him then. One blow with the rifle butt. One hard pull of the trigger at close range. The temptation came through him, so strong it felt almost holy. Then he saw Noah watching. Moral men are not born in easy weather. They are made in moments exactly like that. Jonah let the rifle drop just enough to shove Blackwell backward instead of shooting him. Noah, he barked, to Mara. Now. The roof beam cracked overhead. Reese, half blinded by smoke, made for the door. Blackwell caught at his sleeve, and the foreman ripped free with a curse that told Jonah all he needed to know about loyalty bought in cash. Mara dragged Noah toward the threshold. Jonah turned to follow, and the burning beam came down between them in a shower of sparks. For one terrible instant, all he could see was fire. When Jonah woke, it was to the smell of wet wool, blood, and coffee gone thin over coals. He was lying on a bunk in an old shepherd's hut farther up the cut, his left arm bandaged hard from shoulder to elbow. Dawn light came pale through the chinked wall. Every breath tasted of smoke. Noah was curled asleep on a pallet by the stove, one hand fisted in Mara's skirt even in sleep. Mara sat on a stool beside Jonah with her hair braided back again and a burn blushing red across the back of one hand. You took long enough, she said, and the relief in her voice nearly undid him. He tried to sit. Pain answered fast. Blackwell escaped in the dark. Reese too, though I doubt with much dignity left. Noah kicked him twice where it counts. That almost earned a laugh, but Jonah was too tired for it. He looked at the boy. He all right. He swallowed smoke and fury. Both passed by the sound of him an hour ago. Jonah closed his eyes. For a long moment, there was only the small stove popping and the distant hush of creek water moving over stones. I went to town the day Ruth died, he said at last. Mara waited. Not for a doctor. Not at first. His throat tightened around the memory. Blackwell sent word he was calling the note. Ruth had a fever already, but she said she'd be fine till night. I told myself if I settled it quick, I'd ride back with medicine. We argued half the afternoon in his office while she was here getting colder by the hour. By the time I fetched the doctor and got home, he swallowed hard. She was awake enough to know I'd come in. Not awake enough to forgive me for being gone. Mara's face changed, not with judgment, but with that terrible mercy that makes a man say more than he planned. So every time somebody reaches for this house, Jonah said, voice rough, I think on who pays for it. Ruth did. Now you. Noah. Mara looked down at her burned hand. My husband died in a mine cave-in outside Phillipsburg. 3 months later, our baby girl followed him before she'd seen a spring. Folks said I was still young enough to begin again. They say that to women as if beginning were a chore like sweeping. After a while, I stopped believing there was anything in me worth choosing except for work. Jonah turned his head to her. The morning light found the scar on her jaw and made nothing ugly of it at all. She gave a small, sad smile. So I hired myself into other people's homes and told my heart it was the same thing. He stared at the ceiling a long moment, then said, lonely ain't the same as empty. Mara's eyes lifted. Empty means nothing can grow, Jonah said. Lonely just means it hasn't yet. The words sat between them, warm as a blanket straight from the line. Mara reached for the tin cup on the stool and held it out. Jonah took it with his good hand. Their fingers brushed. Such a small thing. Such a dangerous one. Then Noah stirred, blinked awake, and looked wildly from one to the other until he understood he was safe. He got up and crossed the room fast, as if afraid safety might move if he didn't catch it in time. He threw his arms around Mara first. Then, after one uncertain heartbeat, around Jonah too, careful of the bandage. I thought the fire got you, he whispered. Jonah pressed his lips to the boy's hair. Smoke, wool child. Home, stripped down to its truest pieces. Not yet. If this part of the story is finding you where you live, then you are exactly who stories like this are written for. And if you want more of them, a like and a subscribe is a quiet way of saying keep bringing these hearts home. Mara drew back enough to look at Noah. Listen to me now. We go down that mountain today, and whatever happens in town, You stay where I can see you. Understood. Noah nodded fiercely. Outside, dawn had turned the frost silver on the bunch grass. The storm had never come from the sky, but the morning smelled washed clean anyway, pine resin and ash and cold stone. It would have been easy to run then. Take the back trail west, trade the horses at the reservation line, vanish into some other valley where Vernon Blackwell's name weighed nothing. Jonah thought about it for less than a second. Then he stood, pale with pain, and said, "Let's finish it." The hearing was held in the schoolhouse because the courthouse roof was being repaired. Jonah had never liked the place more. By the time they arrived, bandaged and smoke-stained, half the valley had gathered. News outruns horses when a rich man's barn burning turns into whispered kidnapping before breakfast. Amos Hatcher was there, rubbing his counter-polishing thumb against his palm. Mrs. Weller, the midwife, sat ramrod straight near the front, hatpins shining like drawn steel. Sheriff Bell stood by the wall, working that bad tooth with his tongue. Vernon Blackwell sat at the front table in a fresh coat, his left wrist wrapped under the cuff. He looked restored already, as men like him often do, as if money itself were antiseptic. The probate judge from Hamilton, Ezra Pike, peered over his spectacles. "Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Ellis, you appear to have had an eventful night." "You might say so," Jonah answered. Proceedings began with the note, then the guardianship petition. Blackwell's lawyer spoke first, long and oily about instability, educational neglect, lack of female propriety, and the hazards of frontier child-rearing. He used the word welfare, so often Jonah wanted to break something. Then it was Jonah's turn. He did not give them anger. He gave them truth. He told them about the fire, the cut fence, the broken smokehouse, the rider with Noah over the saddle. He set the damaged deed box on the table. Mara laid out the receipts in rows so neat the whole room leaned forward. Judge Pike frowned. "Mrs. Ellis, what exactly am I seeing here?" "A ledger walked crooked," she said, "and a man hoping no one would notice." She showed the altered figures, the principal diverted, the trust payment never credited, the difference in ink on the note entries. The seal impression lifted badly enough that even Pike could see the blur. She spoke plainly, without performance, the way women speak when they have done enough explaining in one lifetime and have no appetite left for another round. Blackwell laughed once. "A domestic servant interpreting bank practice. We truly are in a golden age." Amos Hatcher rose from the back before anybody called him. It startled even him. "I sold coal oil to Reese Doolin after dusk yesterday," he said, voice shaking. 2 tins. He said it was for branding irons at the South Lot, but that was a lie. And he swallowed hard. "And Blackwell's clerk had me hold duplicate payment slips these past months. Said the bank books were crowded. I knew it smelled wrong. I did nothing. That's on me." A murmur rolled through the schoolhouse. Blackwell's lawyer snapped. "This is hearsay and opportunism." Mrs. Weller stood next. "Then add this. I sat with Ruth Bennett the night she married Jonah against her father's wishes. I sat with her the night Noah was born. I sat with her the night she died. And if any man here means to pretend she wished her father to raise that boy, he's lying before God and women both. There are moments when a room stops belonging to power and starts belonging to truth. You can feel the shift in the air like a weather turn." Still Blackwell held himself steady. "Sentiment," he said coolly. "Nothing more." Then the back door opened. Reese Doolin came in, half supported by Deputy Noland, his cheeks swollen, one eyebrow singed away. The foreman looked like a man who had learned in one hard night that employers make poor shields. Sheriff Bell stepped forward. Found him at Miller's Creek bed trying to light out on a lame horse. Judge Pike rapped the table. "Mr. Doolin, do you have testimony relevant to this hearing?" Reese glanced at Blackwell. Whatever promise had once stood between them was gone now. "He told me to scare the widower," Reese muttered. "Cut the fence. Break the lock. Make the place look careless. Then last night," his mouth twitched. "Last night he said bring the boy and the box. Said there'd be a paper signed by morning one way or another." The room erupted. Blackwell surged to his feet. "You drunken animal. I ought to have left you in that fire." And there it was. Not confession in the shape a lawyer would call pure, but truth plain enough for every ear in the room. Jonah watched Judge Pike's face close like a gate. Sheriff Bell moved first. He came around the table, hand on his revolver, bad tooth forgotten. Vernon Blackwell, on suspicion of fraud, arson, and attempted abduction, I am placing you under arrest pending formal charges. Blackwell turned on Jonah then. All the polish burned off him at last. This valley made you nothing, he hissed. Everything you have touched decays. Jonah stepped close enough that only the first row could hear him. He was tired, wounded, smoky, and poorer than the man being taken down. Yet he had never stood straighter. No, he said. Everything you touched, you tried to own. That's not the same thing. Sheriff Bell took Blackwell by the arm. The banker jerked free once, then saw the room he had ruled for years and understood, maybe for the first time, that nobody was lowering their eyes. Noah slipped his hand into Jonah's good one. The rest came hard and fast, as true justice often does after years of delay. Judge Pike suspended the guardianship petition at once, ordered independent review of the mortgage, and placed Blackwell Bank's books under county seal. Other farmers stepped forward before noon. 2 widows, a trapper, even Bell's own brother-in-law. Payment entries that bent, notes that lengthened instead of shrinking. Blackwell's holdings were frozen before sunset. By month's end, his bank had been stripped open ledger by ledger, and the money he had used to tighten ropes around other people's lives was being used to pay them back. The North Field stayed with Jonah. Noah's inheritance from Ruth was placed in trust exactly as she had intended. Reese Doolin bargained testimony for a prison term shorter than he deserved. Blackwell, who had spent 20 years speaking like judgment itself, left the valley in chains and silence. That should have been the end of the story. But endings worth anything are never only about what evil loses. They are about what goodness finally dares to keep. 3 evenings after the hearing, when the burned barn still smelled of wet ash and fresh-cut pine from the new beams going up, Jonah found Mara on the porch, sewing by lantern light. Noah was asleep inside, one arm flung over the blue ribbon now tied to the bedpost where he could see it. Jonah leaned against the rail. "I've been thinking." Mara smiled without looking up. "That sounds dangerous." "It usually is." He waited until she met his eyes. "I hired a nanny. Turns out she was better at accounts, fires, children, and courage than advertised. That your proposal?" "Getting there." He drew a breath that felt strangely like the first honest one in months. "I can pay your wages through winter if that is what you want." Mara's mouth twitched. "And if it isn't?" He stepped closer. The night smelled of cut hay and the cold promise of snow far up the mountains. "Then I am done hiring you, Mara Ellis. If you stay, it has to be because this is your home too. Because Noah reaches for you before sleep. Because I do. Because somewhere between the windmill and the fire I forgot how to imagine this house without your step in it." She searched his face long enough that he let himself feel every second. "And if I say yes?" she asked. "Then I'd ask again proper come spring. In front of whoever matters." "Who matters?" "You. The boy. Maybe the Lord, if he ain't too busy." She laughed then, soft and sudden, and the sound went through him like light through a shuttered room. "I think," she said, setting the sewing aside, "he might spare a minute." When she stood, Jonah touched her cheek with the backs of his fingers first, giving her time to turn away if she wished. She did not. The kiss was not young. It was better. It carried grief acknowledged, fear survived, and the shy astonishment of 2 people discovering that tenderness can return to a life without asking permission from the dead. From inside the house came Noah's sleepy voice. "If she stays," he called, not quite awake. "Can we stop calling her the nanny?" Mara pressed her forehead to Jonah's shoulder and laughed again. By late spring, the new barn stood straighter than the old one ever had. The valley, having chosen its side, took to the Bennetts with embarrassing enthusiasm. Quilts arrived. Seed sacks arrived. Mrs. Weller arrived with cuttings for a kitchen herb patch and enough opinions to fence in 3 counties. Amos Hatcher extended store credit with such excessive courtesy Jonah began charging him extra in discomfort. Sheriff Bell, now a little more careful with rich men and a little less afraid of poor truth, started dropping by on market days mainly to hear Noah read aloud from the newspaper. And Noah did read now, halting sometimes, then cleaner, then with a confidence that made the words seem glad to be spoken. He laughed again too. Not every hour. Not even every day. Grief does not leave a child because grown people finally do right. But it loosened its grip enough to let joy sit down beside it. In June, under a sky so blue it looked freshly painted, Jonah married Mara beside the cottonwoods at the creek. Noah stood between them in boots polished past all reason, holding the blue ribbon wound once around his wrist for luck. When Judge Pike asked who gave the bride, Noah said, clear enough for every person there to hear, "We all do." A year later, on a late summer evening soft with crickets, Mara stood barefoot on the porch while Noah and Jonah brought in the last of the peach crates from the south trees they had planted near the rebuilt barn. The house glowed gold behind her. Supper cooled on the table. A baby girl slept in the basket by the open window, one small fist tucked under her chin like she had business with tomorrow already. Jonah set down the crate, came up the steps, and rested his flour-dusted hand at the small of Mara's back as if it had always belonged there. Noah leaned against the rail, taller now, sun-browned and bright-eyed, and announced that next year he meant to manage his own row in the garden because a man ought to grow at least one thing he could not blame on anybody else. Jonah smiled and said, "The good thing about a field broken open is that it's finally ready to hold something new." Below them the wheat moved in the evening wind like something alive and at peace, and the porch lamp laid one warm square of light over the three of them while the mountains, at last, looked as if they were keeping watch. Next time, we'll tell the story of a deaf woman sent away to a remote cattle ranch because her brothers were ashamed of her, and the scarred rancher who learned her language before he ever learned to ask her name.